But yeah, thank you, Janice, for joining me today for this Woman in Leadership interview series as part of IDGA's Women's Network. So I always love to begin these interviews just learning a little bit about yourself. So I was wondering if maybe you could tell me just a bit about your background, a bit about your current role at Identity Strategy Partners, your educational background, how you came to get interested in the biometrics space, national security space in the first place.
Okay, so it's hopefully not a sordid story, but it is a little bit long story because I've had a career that's 25 years old now at this point. So I will skip about 15 years of it, but I will focus on sort of the beginning-ish of it and then sort of where I am now. I think if we want to just get the educational piece off the ground first, I went to Duke University. I was very privileged to go to Duke. I love Duke. And then I went to Villanova Law School. So I'm a lawyer by trade. And that leads me to sort of the next parts of my life. In February 1993, the first attack on the World Trade Center happened. This is the answer to the question of how I got interested in national security issues. My brother-in-law was in the building. He was 30 years old. He was on the 40th floor. Only there were a few people that died in that bombing, but for those that remember that bombing, the bomb was detonated in a service truck that was parked in the underground parking lot. That underground parking lot caved in, and the building sort of collapsed a bit into it. The smoke filled the entire building. The only way to get out was the fire escape stairwell. My brother-in-law was 6'4". He was a really big guy. He was a journalist. And there were doors that were locked on the intervening floors with people screaming, trying to get out. He was breaking down doors and helping people out. Those are also the days really before cell phones of any note. All the power was knocked out down there. So we did not know until it happened at around 9 o'clock in the morning-ish. We did not know until 5 o'clock in the afternoon that he was okay and he was safe. It was terrifying. Moreover, he then passed away in May of 1993 from heart complications that had been most likely heavily complicated by all the smoke inhalation he had had. He was playing ultimate frisbee in Central Park and just keeled over and died. So that had a huge impact on me and my ex-husband at the time. And I held that in my heart. In 5 years later, I had the opportunity. We had moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. My ex-husband had become a Bloomberg reporter covering Congress. It was a great job. I had to leave the law to help support him. That was my choice. We had a new baby. And I came to D.C. without being able to practice law. So I had not been practicing long enough to swap over my certifications into DC. So the only way I could get back into law a couple years later was to see if I could work in Congress. That was the loophole. You don't have to have your legal certifications active if you're working in Congress as a lawyer. So I called Senator. I've always had a lot of chutzpah, and this is something that I would advise anyone to have. I called Senator Specter's office, said, I'm from Pennsylvania. I would like to see if there's any opportunities. I said, we have a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee. Even being a lawyer and taking constitutional law and everything, I didn't really understand how Congress worked. We have a subcommittee, it's terrorism and technology. Senator Specter is the chairman of it. We need help down there. I went in, I had to have childcare. I, for free, worked for Senator Specter in that terrorism subcommittee. that was my introduction to doing terrorism policy. They asked me to support a hearing on the Olympics. Remember, there was a bombing in Atlanta at the Olympics? So there was a hearing on that. I put together that entire hearing. They liked what I did. And then when Senator Arlen Specter matriculated off of that subcommittee, I went to the new chairman's office. I sat in the foyer for about 2 hours. I waited for the chief of staff to have time to see me, and I begged them to take me on as counsel as in the subcommittee because I had already had a few months there, and I argued continuity and all that stuff, and they hired me. So that was the Terrorism and Technology Subcommittee. We were Judiciary Committee. So because we were Judiciary Committee, we had oversight over the Department of Justice. Department of Justice, everybody knows, is FBI. But at the time, it was also the Immigration and Naturalization Service before 9/11. So I was working for a border senator. He asked me to look into why these two individuals who had supposedly been deported ended up attempting to bomb the Brooklyn subway. I did that report. I found a lot of problems with our immigration system. I also, at the same time, did a hearing on the 5-year anniversary of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing on the current threat of foreign terrorist activity in the United States. People thought we were crazy. They thought 1993 World Trade Center was just an anomaly. It would never happen again. And we showed that actually that was not true at all, and that we were under threat. And I was also doing all this other immigration stuff. And I also was tasked with putting forth a bill on identity theft, which basically took the federal criminal prosecutory law for identity was paper. It was based on paper crime. We were beginning to have the internet. We were beginning to see digitization. I was tasked with taking a look and making sure that the language was updated to any potential digital threat, which was hard to do in 1998 because we didn't know what the threats could be in digital identity at the time. So it was a process of writing the language. Anyway, I got that passed, unanimous consent in both the House and the Senate, and signed by President Clinton. So that was my piece of an identity theft. Then I had been working with the Immigration and Naturalization Service on border security, and I had been working counterterrorism. So when 9/11 happened, I then took more time off. I had 2 more children, took more time off. And when 9/11 happened, I thought, I have to go do this. I have to. There can't be anybody else in the country that has the experience that I have pulling together immigration, national security. I didn't think identity was a piece of it. I just thought it was counterterrorism and the counterterrorism piece primarily. So I was very lucky. I was the only staffer that didn't have connections to the 9/11 Commission and the 9/11 commissioners. I wasn't a detail from another part of government. I was the only staffer just hired on because of her experience. And I hadn't worked for 2.5 years. So I was extremely grateful. There were a lot of applications. I was extremely grateful to be hired on, and I worked my tail off. And we did a full investigation in 14 months, produced the terrorist travel monograph for the 9/11 Commission, and then I was the primary author for the 9/11 recommendations on terrorist travel. I came up with that term. I came up with the term assuring people are who they say they are. I came up with a lot of ways to explain the issue of national security being related to border security and why biometrics would help solve that problem, even though biometrics were nascent at the time. So there was a whole weave of things that happened. And the whole piece of identity came to me during the 9/11 Commission investigation when I was tasked with figuring out if the hijackers really were who we thought they were on the manifest list. And I had paper records that were incomplete, that were handwritten. There were 360 aliases with the hijackers. It was impossible to figure out the play, but a physical attribute would solve the problem. So if we could get biometrics to be technologically sound, we were on our way. And so that is why the recommendations regarding identity were so pronounced in the recommendations. It was based on what we found. I did not go in thinking that I was going to find that, but that is what the investigation led us to, and that is what we ended up And so from 2004, when we published that report, up until, for over a decade, I was testifying before Congress, being on national TV all the time, talking about these issues. We got border security with biometrics around the world. We got Real ID, that was mine as well. I know people will grimace when I say that, but Real ID was mine as well, because we knew that minimum standards were required. The hijackers had used legitimate Virginia, Florida, and other states' IDs to board the planes on the morning of 9/11 because they had used fraud to get those IDs. So something needed to be done to standardize access to driver's licenses because they're such a primary document in the US. So it's a long weave to get where I've been. And so then in 2017, I founded Identity Strategy Partners. I'm a woman-owned small. I'm actually an 8A now too, which means that I can get sole source from the government. It took me years to get that designation. And I work primarily with DoD and DHS. I've done a little bit with the State Department as well. I have a few employees. I really stay in my niche, though. I do not try to do everything at all. But it's a privilege to still work on these issues. So yeah, that's my long story.
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate it. I know it's not easy to summarize years of work into a couple minutes, but I think you did it succinctly and ardently. So I appreciate your thought behind that. Um, so I know one milestone that you didn't mention along the way was your recognition in 2015 as with the Woman in Biometrics Award. And I'm just curious, how did that accolade impact your career, and what advice would you give to other young women who aspire to win that award one day?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So the Women in Biometrics Award, the reason it did become, I'm interested you asked that question because it was valuable to me, because it was the first time where I was actually, it was the first time that award was ever given. So there were about 50 women, I guess, that were put forward for it. And I won the award along with a handful of other women that were very well qualified as well. But what was said and what I hold close to my heart was that I, because of my recommendations, because of the investigation I did with the 9/11 Commission, and because of the way I articulated the issues around identity, I really helped found biometrics in government and the industry too, actually, but really helped ground biometrics as a working laws and policy, because there is law. There are both statutory law and executive orders. There's policies around this now. And while it's not perfect, I'm very proud of the fact that groundwork, I was able to do that groundwork, not the accolade for it, but that I was able to do that work. And I think that is more important to me than the award, the fact that I actually was able to do that work. The award was a recognition for that work. And so it was a nice moment for me because it was actually articulated by other people, and I never asked anybody to say that. So that was very nice.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and then just so I understand that workplace bias is a part of American workplaces today, and gender discrimination is a big part of that. And I also understand that when it comes to Homeland Security, it is a more male-dominated space. So, I won't ask you to provide specific examples of times you experienced discrimination, but I would love to hear your tips and advice you would give to young women in national security for how they can navigate these challenges and ultimately overcome them.
Yeah, so it's a tough question because I want to stay positive with my commentary to you, but there's a reality to it that I wouldn't be genuine or authentic if I didn't express the reality. So I'm going to start by answering this by saying I have what is called this 8A designation. This 8A designation for my company, Identity Strategy Partners. You don't get that 8A designation as a white woman without having proven examples of discrimination in your career. So let's just say I proved it, okay? Because I got the 8A designation and it's not easy to get. So the things that I've been up against have actually been quite significant. Not going into details, but I will say it is absolutely worth it to do the work. There's a degree of, I will even call it intoxication for being able to do true public good. And that is what keeps you going, right? Knowing that you're doing real good. But in the way of all of that, you're going to have to deal with exclusion, old boys clubs. You're going to have to deal with dismissiveness. You're going to have to deal with jealousy when you do well. And it comes in all kinds of ways, mansplaining, and, you know, downright frustration at you when you quietly stand your ground and do what you need to do. It's not easy. And it's taken a long time to kind of figure out how to navigate it. I still don't sometimes. But there are things that you can do to try to help get there. But it will take time. It takes time and growth personally to be able to do what you need to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I understand, you know, when we discussed before the interview begun that you touched a lot on how important resiliency is as an attribute. And I was wondering if you could share a little more with me right now about what resiliency looks like to you and just how impactful that mindset has been for you as your career's grown and developed.
Yeah, so resiliency to me has a lot of different nuance factors to it. There's standing up again after something negative has happened. There's confidence in that you have something valuable to offer. There's the moral fiber of doing the right thing at the right time. And then there's also staying the course. And there's a need for purpose. If you don't have a sense of all of those, you're going to have trouble being resilient. But in addition to resiliency, I think, especially for women, it's incredibly imperative because of the sensitivity of the culture that you're dealing with. You have to have a tremendous amount of social intelligence, and that takes time. And even today, I messed that up. I messed it up today, even. So it's never perfect, and it's always a work in progress. But you really have to learn and consider the circumstances that you're in and read the room. And it's not enough just to be emotionally intelligent. You have to be socially intelligent. And that means you have to understand what's happening around you and respond to it appropriately. So you need to know when to fold and walk away. You need to know when to run away. You need to know when to stand your ground and engage appropriately. And it's tricky. It's very tricky. And underneath all of that, you have to have some moral fiber. You have to have a sense of what your limits of right and wrong are and where those lines are drawn so that you're not constantly in the wave of what should I do? What should I do? It has to become intuitive. It has to become, and that takes time. So I would caution patience with yourself. Nobody gets it right for a while. And one other thing I would say is value the good relationships around you. If you find good people, value it. I know everybody wants to climb. I know everybody wants the next best job, but finding good people that you can work with and you trust is not easy. So if you got something good, really consider what you're going to do with that before you make decisions around it. Don't throw away the good people or the good things around you. Keep them close. And that would be the other thing I would say.
Yeah, that's terrific. I think we can't do this alone. When it comes to your own career, you need advice, you need mentorship, you need guidance, and that's such a critical element of career development. So yeah, I'm curious to hear from you. It's kind of a two-part question then. What mentorship experiences you've had, whether that's finding a mentor for yourself or being a mentor for someone else. What does that strong mentorship look like? And then the second part is what would your advice be to a man who is works with young women and might be in a position to act as their mentor? What would your advice be to them to be able to uplift a kind of underrepresented group in the national security space?
Oh gosh, that's a really interesting and difficult question. Um, okay, the first question was mentorship for me. So I would say I'm not sure I had mentors per se. I had some people that I considered very high moral fiber, extremely intelligent, knew how to get stuff done, and I watched them very closely. Some of them were chief counsels, some were assistant secretaries, some were, they were all people that I knew personally. But I would look to this person for how does he articulate an argument? I will say one place where I got sort of indirect mentorship was the old version of the US Senate before it got very disparate and political. When there was a time in the late 1990s when I was there, because I went back a couple times later as like a special counsel and stuff. But when I was there in the late 90s, we could work bipartisan. I insisted. Now, some people that I was working with didn't like it at all because I was talking to the other side and they didn't like it. And I'm like, I want to get stuff done. That's why I'm here. So I'm going to get stuff done. But the way I would hear the senators talk to each other in Senate Judiciary, now almost all of these people were lawyers and they were high ranking lawyers before they became representatives. And then the cream of the crop out of the House of Representatives become senators. The level of articulateness that I would hear and the way they would articulate their commentary to each other and the level of diplomacy was immaculate. They would be in their arguments basically screaming at each other, but you would never hear that amongst them. They would, with all due respect, and they would articulate their arguments in a way that was deeply diplomatic and respectful, and they got stuff done. And so I think when you asked me this question, I think that's really what I took forward in my career was how to work bipartisan. Right now, one of my biggest abilities is stakeholder engagement. I can bring anybody of very diverse opinions into a room and get them to agree to something. It's just my skill. And I think it's partly from that piece. So mentorship directly, I never had the perfect boss. I would say the 9/11 Commission probably was seeing how the commissioners worked with each other. That was also a huge learning ground. But in terms of one-to-one, I was always kind of a woman that was an anomaly in this space and on the outside. So I didn't have somebody to pick up the phone and call. I didn't have that. Um, I wish I had, but I just didn't. So that's kind of where I am with that question. With men who are mentoring, who are in a position with having young women around them, I think the most important thing is respect um, and a self-awareness about behavior. There is an incestuousness of a way that women are considered and spoken to that is different than men. There is an ability to justify exerting anger in a different way at a woman than they would at another man. There is a way of being dismissive. There is a way of getting jealous unnecessarily. when a woman does well. So I think it's about, in this case with men, being emotionally intelligent about themselves, really considering what they are saying and doing and how that might affect others. It is different dealing with women. We are not more emotional. We are not. In fact, we have to be less emotional in the workplace to be respected. So it is looking at the typical things that are said about women that are derogatory and really considering whether you are thinking and doing that is, I think, really important. And I think it's a lot to ask because of the way our society is, but I don't think it gets better unless everybody's sensitive to it. And with women, you know, they have to be also aware of, is this because I'm a woman or is this just this person? There's some intelligence around that too. So it's not always personal. It's not always personal. It's not always because you're a woman. Sometimes that person is just the way they are. So it's not always easy to decipher it. But I think there needs to be some sensitivity around what is acceptable and should it be acceptable, and being able to ask some questions around that. It's a very vague answer. I apologize, but it's about the best I can come up with without being more specific.
No, I think it was great. I think it answered the core elements of things a man might have to keep in mind when looking
Yeah.
to take on a mentorship role.
We're also going to be the hardest workers you ever had. So, you know, we
Great.
can juggle everything, especially women who have become moms. We can literally juggle everything. We know how to do it. And, you know, it's not too much for us to do. But being respectful of our needs is also important. And that's across the board for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
great.
non-gender specific.
Mhm. Yeah. So far in this conversation, I feel like we've touched on, you know, handling workplace biases and finding a mentor and what that mentor should look like. I don't think we've really touched on what it takes to get your foot in the door. And so I'm wondering then, do you have any advice or tips for a young woman who is really just starting their career, maybe postgraduate, and looking to get their foot in the door in the national security space? What would your advice to them be?
So, I mean, I have to look back on what I did, and I would never have had any career at all if I hadn't done what I did. You got to have a little chutzpah. You got to just like pick up the phone and make the call. But, you know, I struggle sometimes when I hear young people talk about, and I understand why. Things are super expensive, but things weren't free when I was young. And um you got to just sometimes do the work to get the experience. You're not just going to get hired because you went to a good school and you got good grades and you were president of the glee club. Like, doesn't work like that. You need to show you have experience, and the only way to get it sometimes is to humble yourself and do it for free. I mean, I had a child and I was a lawyer and I went and worked for free. Like, what? Yeah, I wasn't just graduated from college. I was a full-blown lawyer that had been practicing. I went back to work for free um, because I want it to work and because I wanted the experience and I want it to be valuable. So if you want something bad enough, show it and be willing to do what you need to do to get it, and then work your butt off when you go do it. No, you know, yeah, you gotta work hard. That's just the way it is. And you gotta believe in yourself. And I actually like it when young people reach out to me and are bold. Like, good for you. Thanks. Like, you know, I'm on the Duke alum thing, a young woman from Duke. She's an entrepreneur. She has an amazing degree. She was on Shark Tank. Like, she reached out to me and I'm like, cool. I like this girl. Like, she's going for it. She's trying to be an entrepreneur. Wouldn't say I'm, you know, unicorn yet or anything, but you know, I like some drive. I like some willingness to take a chance. Go for it. Just go for it. Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
I love that. Yep. The best way to find success is just taking that first step and really putting
Yeah.
yourself out there. Yeah,
Yep.
great. So then moving along here, I'd love to kind of summarize everything and really just look back on your career and reflect. And I'd love to know, is there an accomplishment that you're most proud of, or accomplishments you're most proud of? And when thinking about your legacy, when leaving this space, I mean, is there anything that you'd hope to leave behind for future women in biometrics and homeland security?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, I had a career I never expected. I never expected to be anything more than a staffer. I was thrilled to be a staffer in the Senate. I was thrilled to be a staffer on the 9/11 Commission. I never thought I would be public. I didn't ask to go public. It was pushed upon me based on the work I did. I first went public in the U.S. Senate in a hearing above in front of my old committee. So I never, but my proudest work has to be my work for the 9/11 Commission. It was very proud for me to be able to serve my country that way. I felt like I was honoring my ex-brother-in-law's as well and his untimely death. As well, I always held that in my heart. And so even though I was very straightforward as an investigator on the 9/11 Commission staff, I never talked to any victims or anything else. I understood their pain. And it was very personal to me, as professional as I was in that, it was very personal to me too. I think there are like two or three big things for me. The other thing is being recognized by Duke University as one of their most influential alums of the entire decade that I graduated in. And I was absolutely stunned because there are a whole lot smarter people than me that went to Duke, so who have done amazing things. So that was like, wow. And then like national interviews with like Leslie Stahl and Megyn Kelly, and like those were all some major reporters. Like that was really diving deep on what we learned from 9/11, and being able to broadcast that education was really cool. And then sticking out as a double entrepreneur. Like I have Identity Strategy Partners. I'm launching a software firm in January that I'm supporting fully myself. I'm running, so I'm CEO of two companies right now. Super excited to launch. It's been talk about resilience. Oh my God. I've had to pick myself up in both of these companies 2, 3 times from like major difficulties. And I'm really proud of myself for just keeping going and still being here. So yeah.
Great, thank you. I know that IDGA is no Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes, but we appreciate the time you've given us today. And yeah, and so I know that you'll be at an IDG event in December at our
Yeah.
Biometric for Government and Law Enforcement event in DC. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what you're looking forward to gaining from the event experience and why you think it's important to be there on site in December.
So the nice thing about the IDGA events is that they're very densely packed with subject matter experts and operational leads throughout the government. And so it's sort of a jam-packed networking event, as well as being able to hear some of the very inside baseball as to what's going on in the agencies. It's not a superficial conference. It's a very sort of get into the mud and make the clay kind of conference. I don't know about that analogy, but it's very much that way to me. You actually can mold clay and have something come of it. You can have something come of it at the end of it. Building the relationships, and because we're in the sort of 27% of the population is now remote and I work remote, having the opportunity always at these types of events to see your colleagues is super important. And it's more important now than it was before when we were all in person working. Um, now we don't even see the colleagues in our own business that we work with, right? Like we don't even see them. So I think it's super valuable. I'll be excited being with Mr. Cruzet, who ran the Defense Forensics and Biometric Agency for a number of years. And I worked at DOD for 5 years for the chief engineer. And I have some contracts there now, which lead identity intelligence and screening and vetting. So I am still have my hand in there, and I am still work with them regularly. So even though technically I work for DHS, I still work with DOD a lot because I have a lot of friends there and in high places. So just doing my bit in public. That's my public service side. Just whatever they need, I'm there for. So I'm excited to support. I think you're mute. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janice, for that response. And we look forward to seeing you in December. And also thank you for joining our Women in Leadership series today.
Oh, yeah, I love to do it. And thank you for having me.